Look at this. Let's take the first explanation for what happened. That like there was some kind of avalanche or an avalanche sound, and they all went running out of the tent. And some of the early passages and early research was like, well, these people are experienced, and if you look at that mountain, it really isn't the right shape of a mountain and the right steepness for an avalanche to happen. And I'm like, well, but they didn't necessarily know that. I mean, they set up their campsite in the middle of a blizzard.
And we are live. Once again, this is the Solvable Mysteries Podcast, episode number 8. My name is Juras, and as usual, I'm joined by my good friend, a co-host as well, Glenn Highcove. How are you doing, my friend?
Hi, doing all right. Looking forward to talking about this case. This is another one I've had my eye on for a few years now.
Yep, same here. So, without any further ado, today's topic is the Dyatlov Pass Incident. So, it was an event where 9 people have died in the northern Ural Mountains between the 1st and 2nd of February 1959. The death have came in, uncertain circumstances. Basically, the group of 9 that have died were all experienced trekkers who were all from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and they had established a camp on the slopes of one of the Ural Mountains in an area now named in honor of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. During the night, something caused them to tear their way out of their tents and flee the campsite, all while inadequately dressed for the heavy snowfall and the harsh sub-zero temperatures. So right now on the screen you can see basically the group of 9 trekkers who sadly have passed away under uncertain circumstances back in 1959. Right, so any sort of initial thoughts on your side about the incident, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, it's so. My initial thoughts are like this whole trip is very interesting to me. So being from a pretty warm part of the United States, where at least in Los Angeles we almost never see any snow, and we have to drive a couple hours to even see snow. It's a little bit alien to me, this big kind of crazy cross country skiing snow camping trip up a mountain. Have you ever done anything like this? Is this more common where you live?
Yeah, like we get a lot of snow, especially like during the winter here in Lithuania. But I've never really skied or did anything like that because Lithuania has a lot of like plain fields. We don't really have any mountains. We would have to go to Slovakia, Austria, maybe like the Scandinavian countries for that. So it's not really that popular where I'm from. We don't have like the mountains that Russia has and the Urals and so on. Yeah, so basically right now on the screen you are seeing Igor Dyatlov. So he was a 23-year-old student, and he was essentially the leader of the trekking group. So right, I will just quickly flip to the pictures. So as you can see in this picture, we are now seeing the trekking group of 9 traversing, to the mountains. The other surprising fact is that, back in 1959, they actually had, and we discussed this with Glenn before the podcast, they actually had fairly good quality cameras, I believe, because for pictures from the late 50s, especially in the Soviet Union, I mean, these pictures look fantastic, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, and like these are all very young people that are still in the university or working at the university, so I don't imagine they had a lot of disposable income. But yeah, these are like almost Instagram pictures. They're very clear, and the lighting's perfect. I mean, did somebody send them an iPhone back in time or something?
It's almost like a filter, that like no color filter or something like that,
Yeah.
Yeah, like even back in the day, like I know this is going a little bit off topic, but like even the clothes, like back in the day in the Soviet Union, like things, weren't like completely terrible. To contrary belief, people sort of seem to enjoy themselves. Well, for this group of people, things uh, ended quite badly, I should say. So, right. So, just to give our audience a general understanding on where the Dyatlov Pass is located. So it's located in one of the oblasts in Russia. So you can see it's like right around the Ural Mountains ridge line, I would say, and right, it's marked in red. So it's right in the middle of the Siberia, right? Yeah. So this is basically the Google image, the exact place of the Dyatlov Pass on the Google Maps. We don't really have any sort of visuals better than this Google map right now. However, a man, or I would say a few people have, visited the place, and they have taken their own pictures that you are seeing on the screen right now. So, right, any sort of anything you want to add to the initial background of the event?
No, I mean it's pretty interesting. As we kind of look at it and kind of what set the stage for them going here. Apparently, the group, this was like their little cross country skiing club for like extreme weather, and they were all very experienced. They all were, I think it was, what was it, level 2.
Yep.
There was actually a level. It was like the second tier out of 3, and this was actually going to be, I think, at the end of this trip, this was going to qualify them to be, I guess, certified for the level 3.
Yeah, like for the grade 3, right? So they were all
Yeah.
experienced grade 2 hikers. So to me, what was interesting right now, I'm looking at the ages of all the people who were involved, and they're all in their early 20s, besides Semyon Alexeyevich, who was 38. Everyone else was like in their early 20s. So having a grade 2, um, basically evaluation at that age means that they were probably not your standard Soviet Union city kids. You know what I'm trying to say. They were probably,
Yeah.
they grew up in these areas. So
That's a
yeah,
good distinction. Yeah, that they were maybe more rural, or at least from areas that were adjacent to rural areas where they, like to your point, they were very confident. It makes me wonder if any of them had done kind of like, there must have been the Soviet version of like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, right? I'm assuming like pioneers or whatever they would call it back
yeah,
then. It makes me wonder if these folks have been doing it since like even maybe their early teens or mid teens.
yeah. Very very possibly that they have been doing that. So also a quick just basically a quick look at the distance that the trekking group have covered. So essentially, they arrived on train to the Ivdel city, right? And then they had, I believe, right now on the Google Maps it says around 80 kilometers in a truck, and they have basically reached Wijai, the city of Wijai. So I believe we have a picture of them in the truck. So yeah, I believe this picture was taken right at, I believe, maybe like the second day of their trip, while they were taking this 80-kilometer truck drive to Wijai. Yeah, you want to add something, Glenn?
Yeah, I actually had a question for you. So I think
Okay.
that's the great part. The great part about this case is, it's one that certainly is, at least geographically, a lot closer to you than it is to me. Though I understand it's
Still
still far.
fairly, still far. Yeah, still far.
Yeah, it looks like it's at least as far from you as, let's say Denver is from me, if not longer. But
Yeah,
maybe there's one
similar.
term.
Yeah.
So in the Wikipedia, right in the beginning there, it says they took a truck to Vijay, and then it says a lorry village, and I'm like, I even looked this up because I was like, what the heck is a lorry village? So lorry means truck in English, and in American English, we hear that word lorry, we don't know what the hell that is until we hear the translation, but
Right.
a lorry village. Do you know what that means? I mean, what does that?
I have like no idea, but it's maybe some sort of like a transportation stop for like
Okay,
trucks
yeah.
or something like that. But obviously, I could be mistaken. But
Oh,
that's just my guess. Yeah.
maybe it's like our equivalent of like a truck stop, so some kind of transportation hub.
And also you have to put this into consideration that this is like the late 50s in the Soviet Union. Maybe there is no need for lorry villages anymore. Maybe this is some sort of a Soviet Union thing from back in the day. I'm not really sure like how they handled the logistics in Siberia of all places.
Very,
Right.
very difficult. Well, it is worth mentioning. There's like a lot of videos online of kind of the amazing things that Russian cross country trucks do, like like logging trucks, where
Yeah.
they go underwater and stuff, and like we can't even fathom that here because we don't have trucks that go underwater in the
Yeah.
United States. But in Russia, apparently, it's like just
Yeah.
a normal thing you have to do in Siberia and places like that where you're logging.
Of course,
Yeah,
Russia is definitely so vast. And
yeah,
essentially from Vijay, I believe they, if I'm not mistaken, they took a rest stop, right? So they spent the night in Vijay, I believe so, right? And they decided to
yeah,
trek on the next day. And because essentially the trekking group had 10 members, and one of the members felt ill once they reached Vijay, and I believe he decided to turn back and go back home. And the rest, the other 9 members of the trekking group, they decided to move on forward towards the Dyatlov Pass. Obviously, it wasn't called the Dyatlov Pass back in the day. It was only named that in honor of the leader, Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the trekking group. And essentially, they were heading further north towards the mountains, the Ural Mountains, and it was around 65 kilometers, yeah, just around 65 kilometers from the Vijay village that they had covered essentially on foot. Well, I believe they also covered some of the distance on, yeah, I don't have that picture right now, but some of the distance was they traveled by the help of like horses, like on like horse sleds or something like that. But I feel like for the most part they had to traverse the rugged Siberian winter foresty mountainy areas by foot. So that had to be an exhausting trip, don't you think?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, later on when they describe, at once the tragedy begins, it sounds like even going 100 meters or yards in that terrain was just exhausting if you weren't wearing the right equipment or not prepared.
Exactly. And from the pictures you can see that it wasn't like a smooth walk. They had sleds, they had I don't know what you call these things. I'm not gonna name them right now, but like it seems like a harsh walk for to cover like upwards to like 60 kilometers in these conditions. No wonder this was a grade 3 solidifying trek, essentially. Like if you can manage to pull this off, then I think you should sort of have the highest standard of hiking in the Soviet Union. So that definitely made sense for me.
Yeah, I wonder how much their backpacks weighed.
Oh,
Like it would get progressively lighter, I guess, as you age. So what I myself was a Boy Scout, so I used to do a lot of backpacking,
hmm.
and then like it gets somewhat easier later in the trip as you've kind of gone through some of your food, but still, I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned food because I also wanted to mention like they actually stopped in the village of Wijai, and at least on the Wikipedia article, it said that they had either bought or like taken from somebody like loaves of bread. So, you know that, and that sort of they did that to sort of like keep their strength and just keep their energy. But like seriously, a loaf of bread, and
It's,
that's all you're gonna eat before you make, you know, a super
incredible.
harsh 60-kilometer like trip, you know,
I,
and you're running on a loaf of bread, you know. This is Soviet Union for you, definitely.
we call that nowadays we call that carbo loading when
Yeah,
people like people will intentionally eat like a huge pasta meal or something like that before they run a marathon or
yeah,
do some kind of similar endurance event. So
right, right.
yeah, that sounds very familiar.
Yeah, so, you know, essentially they did manage to cover the distance, and essentially, maybe you have done a little bit more research on this, but they have stopped. I don't really know the reason why they decided to set up their camp right below this mountain ridge right
It's Mountain
here.
Peak. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like yeah.
So reading it, yeah, it's a good question. So it sounds like they were trying to make their way through the pass. So they were going uphill,
Right.
and I think it was the storm had kind of kicked into a higher gear. So that it was at some point they got slightly disoriented, and it's basically like they kind of hung an accidental left. So
Yeah.
the I don't know if they were using a compass or what tools they had to orient themselves, but at some point they were going up and they thought they were going up to reach the top of the pass, the dip between the two mountains.
Yeah.
But instead they made a left, so they were just going up the mountain more. And
Oh,
that's yeah.
definitely. Yeah, yeah. I just remembered researching that. I believe they sort of, because of the harsh storm, they didn't really have like a good, like a good visual on where they were going, and they were essentially going sort of like towards like the exact opposite way that they initially wanted to go, I believe. And once I guess the night came, they decided to just camp out. I believe I've read somewhere that this was probably the decision to camp right below the mountain peak was probably because they wanted to test out their abilities at setting up camp in such a unpleasant area, I should say. So maybe they were feeling overconfident, and they decided, it's getting late, and let's just set up shop right here, right below this mountain peak. Maybe that was the case. Yeah.
The thing I was trying to puzzle over, I was even thinking about this last night while I was trying to get to sleep. I was like, why did they set up on the slope and not like under the shelter of the trees? Or so part of me is like, oh well, it's because there's a lot of branches under the trees. So like if you didn't bring like an air mattress, which they didn't, I'm sure they didn't have, you don't want to be laying on sticks. Like if you ever set up a
Yeah,
tent,
yeah,
you know
yeah.
what I mean? like setting up a tent. It's only after
Right.
you set up the tent that you find every little pebble and twig, under your back when you're trying to go to sleep. So I was like, maybe that's why, or maybe I was just trying to. Maybe some of our subscribers can tell us better why, when you're doing mountain snow camping, why you would want to pick like the snowy part that could potentially have an avalanche or slide away, etc., and
Yeah.
not the part next to the trees. I don't entirely understand that decision.
I mean, yeah, like right now, just looking from this picture, taken on 2016 by Igor Burlov, um, essentially what we're seeing here on this picture is this area right here. Like I believe, what, like 100 meters to the right is essentially the area of the incident. So yeah, as you can see, like the it is on a slope, and I could definitely see how an avalanche could sort of be a real issue in this area. And just below like the mountain where the forest area begins, that area definitely seems a lot more safe to set up a camp than setting up the camp right next to the mountain peak. So It's interesting to me. It doesn't really seem like it's that much of work to just maybe take those, what it seems like 200 meters down like the mountain towards a safer, more foresty area. So right now, looking at these pictures, I'm just realizing this right now. Like, they could probably easily, they could have probably easily chosen a better location to set up their camp. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and then it's interestingly they did actually end up in that forest after whatever
Yep.
happened to them. They'd actually retreated there for some kind of shelter. So it's like why the only thing I can think of other than maybe some other explanation for that's really fundamental to mountain snow camping is exactly what you said, that they were like, you know what, we're just gonna put all the equipment to the test. I don't know if like if that was a good time to do like a pass fail test on your camping equipment and strategy, but that potentially is what they did as young people.
Yeah. So that's definitely that's probably like what I'm thinking is they were feeling overly confident. Maybe they were never in a situation of any danger during their previous trekking experiences, so maybe they didn't really have that sort of foresight to begin with, that this is a dangerous area, even though it was stated that they were all experienced, and being grade 2 trekkers, they should realize this. So it's it's a mystery in itself. Why do you pick such a dangerous place to set up camp? Even myself, I'm not a trekker by any means, but I would probably try to go towards the forest set up camp. But you know um really can't be explained, this decision, right? So essentially, after a while, right, something had happened to the camp, right?
Yeah. So, so like, so it's interesting. I was, there was no mobile phones, and it sounds like there wasn't even a lot of maybe telephones in some of
Exactly.
these rural areas. So apparently, the standard procedure for trips like these was to set some kind of deadline for which the trip would be over, or some kind of checkpoint, so they could, and then what they would do at that point is send a telegram essentially to their loved ones, or to whoever is helping them monitor their safety, saying, hey, guess what, we finished the trip, or we got to point XYZ, at this village, everything's fine, the trip's over,
Right.
all is safe. And unfortunately that didn't happen, and apparently this was not unusual for people to be 48 hours late or longer for trips like this, so they didn't worry about it too much. But then about a week later, their families insisted that the authorities look for their missing loved ones.
Right. So Igor Dyatlov had agreed he would send a telegram to his sports club as soon as the group returned to the village of Wijai. It was expected that this would happen no later than the 12th of February, but Igor Dyatlov had told Yudin before his departure, a friend of his, or I believe Yudin was the person that sort of left the trekking group. I mean, I'm probably getting these names mixed up. Definitely my bad. But before his departure from the group, oh yeah, Yudin was the 10th person of the group that departed. So basically, Dyatlov told him that he expected that the trip would probably take longer, and when the 12th passed and no messages had been received, there was no immediate reaction, as delays of a few days were common with such expeditions. So only on the 20th of February, so 8 days later, then Igor Dyatlov sort of estimated his return to Ujai. Only 8 days later, relatives of the travelers demanded a rescue operation, and the head of the institute sent the first rescue groups. consisting of volunteer students and teachers, and then later the army and the militia forces became involved, with planes, helicopters being ordered to join the rescue operation as well. And then on the 26th of February, the searchers found the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on the mountain ridge. The campsite baffled the search party. Basically, the student who found the tent said that the tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all of the group belongings and shoes had been left behind. So this is his exact statement, quote unquote. Investigators said that the tent had been cut open from the inside. 8 or 9 sets of footprints, left by people who were wearing only socks or a single shoe, or even barefoot, could be followed, leading towards the edge of the nearby woods. And on those nearby woods, they found the bodies of the trekkers. So these are essentially the pictures that I've managed to find on the internet of the deceased trekkers. So yeah, any thoughts on what actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different theories, and then it's interesting also to point out kind of the differences in autopsies between the first group, because it was interesting how, and of course this is all under the kind of the veil and blurriness of Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right.
I definitely know what you're talking about.
Apparently, in the Soviet Union, they were not super big on the freedom of press or the truth necessarily setting you free.
I would agree.
Yeah. we all these things we have to kind of take with like a grain of salt, because
right.
There's even allegations from within Russia itself, from the other investigating parties later, both at the time and then much later, even like today, about there's sort of dispute about the facts and like who was allowed to say what, and whether the investigation was concluded prematurely.
Right.
So yeah, interestingly, they find the bodies, the first group of bodies, when they do their search, and like I said, it looks like the tent is cut from within. They see a bunch of footprints, and they only see the footprints of the party themselves. They don't really see any other like animal or other footprints that they can't match up with bodies yet.
Yep.
And that's where they're like, oh, okay, we found like 5 of them, and 5 of the tragic victims of this event, and it looks like they all froze to death. It looks like they rushed out of their tent in some kind of panic. Not all of them were really dressed appropriately for the outside air, and at some point they started freezing to death. So they started making a fire. It looks like they even split into a couple groups. One group was making a fire. It looks like somebody actually climbed a tree, maybe to try to find their own tent again, because they'd gone a couple hundred meters in the darkness and probably were totally disoriented, didn't really exactly know where all their survival equipment was. And it looks like in that process of trying to survive and stay warm and then find their tent again, people started succumbing to hypothermia, so freezing to death, and some of them started doing what's called paradoxical undressing, which is where people that are freezing to death, when they're very close to the end, their body tricks them, their nervous system tricks them, and makes them feel like they're hot. So they start shedding layers, and it looks like some of those other people put on some of the clothes that the other people were taking off. Which like, can you imagine how that must have looked like if this had been a couple hundred years ago, before people really understood some of those concepts? If you had never been exposed to like, the idea of somebody like actually seeing somebody, freezing to death and doing that, can you imagine how strange that must have looked like witchcraft like a couple hundred years ago? I mean, now we have a scientific explanation for why people freeze to death would suddenly trade clothes.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it just
personally,
so silly.
Yeah, but personally, I would think that it's witchcraft, because I've only realized that was the case, during this research. I've never heard about that. Feeling super hot before when you're experiencing hypothermia. I've never heard that.
Yeah, I don't even remember. So I've mentioned I was a Boy Scout. I took first aid merit badge where they covered both hypo and hyperthermia, so freezing to death or the opposite,
Yeah.
Being too hot, and it wasn't even covered there. I think the first time I ever ran into it was accounts of the German army retreating during World War II from the Soviet Union, and that was part of the whole trap of the Soviet Union was the winter. General winter. So there was I started hearing about that and kind of documentaries about German soldiers that were found pretty much naked because they took it all off.
Definitely interesting. Well, another thing that we definitely have to mention, it's basically the source of all the, I guess, conspiracy theories and just in general theories on what actually happened. That out of the 9 deceased trekkers, 3 of them had quite unusual, what I'm saying, like quite unusual injuries, because the 6 members that died of hypothermia, they had the usual signs of death by, hypothermia, by freezing to death, essentially. But 3 of the members, like Ludmila Alexandrova, she had internal bleeding from severe chest trauma. Then another man, Semyon Alexeyevich, the eldest member of the trekking group, the 38-year-old man, he had a severe chest trauma as well as his eyes were missing, which is, that definitely, this definitely baffles me. And also Nikolai Vladimirovich, he had a fatal skull injury. So these are not signs of freezing to death. You can't explain these injuries by hypothermia. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, exactly. They were very, very strange, and it's weird too because so to parse it out a little bit, I think it was one of the hypothermia victims had like a slightly cracked skull, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for them to really kind of lean away from the hypothermia theory yet. But then a couple months later, I guess during spring, when they went back out there to try to find the other 4 bodies that were still missing, and then they turned up, I guess, in a stream bed, which I think is probably helps with some of the explanations that we're going to get into. But yeah, it was pretty interesting. Where I think one of the women also was missing not just her tongue but her eyeballs as well.
Yeah, well, from this little map, that we are seeing, basically all the people, or at least 3 of the people that had these unusual injuries that they have since sustained, they were all in the same, the same group, because there were like 3 different groups of people during this incident. They all split into 3 parts, I guess, and they were all found after those 2 months, with those injuries. So essentially what could have happened, and it's really reasonable to think that had happened, is that some sort of wild animals or maybe some sort of like birds or something like that sort of saw the dead bodies, and they sort of ate those parts of their bodies. It's definitely a theory, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I'm leaning towards that right now. So that I'm really glad you honed in on like the spectacular injuries, because between that and I think one of the bodies in the sources, I didn't see them actually specify which body had the higher than normal levels of radiation.
Oh yeah. I'm not really sure which one of the bodies had that, but yeah. So that definitely. That definitely sort of alludes to one of the theories, but I guess we'll cover that a little bit later.
I mean, I kind of wonder. I have to wonder. So this is 1959. I mean, atomic technology, let's call it nuclear technology, had been around for a while. But I'm like, how often would like a search like what's not clear to me is whether the higher radiation levels were detected on site on the body, or whether they got back to the little town or wherever else they did the autopsies, and then maybe a medical examiner had a Geiger counter They measure radiation. I'm like, how are they doing that? That seems kind of like random, right? That they
that
were checking that.
that's really random, and given the fact that it's the late 50s in the Soviet Union, I think the credibility of these findings are dim, to say the least. Like, what I'm trying to say, like,
Yeah.
back in the day, who's to say that all of these all of these people didn't have radiation in their bodies, and maybe the radiation was so severe that they sort of couldn't deny it, that the government couldn't deny it, so they just sort of said that only like one person had radiation. So like, like the credibility of the actual findings, I think the only thing we can actually go speculate from is the pictures, and maybe like the eyewitnesses of the civilians, other students, whatever, like the government of the Soviet Union, especially back in the 50s, stated. I think it's really, really hard to believe, because everything was falsified back then, absolutely everything. So
Yeah. It seems like
yeah.
such a weird thing to check for. Like, why would they even be checking for that? Like, I don't know that. Like, let's suppose like I drop dead right now.
Right.
I don't know that like the Los Angeles medical examiner is gonna like go whip out a Geiger counter and run it over my body to see if I was irradiated. Maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe it is some kind of, maybe somebody one of our subscribers in the comments will say, "Oh no, this has been normal since 1945 in all countries," or whatever it is. But yeah, it just seems odd. And then it's also worth calling out that, like, well, these are students at a university, and certainly I'm not really sure what kind of students they were, so I don't know what their area of expertise was. But I could see where somebody that was maybe working in physical materials or nuclear science or something like that, where like, I mean, even like sometimes we hear radioactive and we think nuclear weapons, but like radioactive could also just be stuff for X-ray machines, right? It could be, there's lots of things that are radioactive.
So basically, all of the people who tragically passed away in the Dyatlov Pass incident, they were all from the Ural State Technical University. And what I'm reading is that they probably had some sort of a history with those sort of materials. And all I can, from whatever I'm gathering as we speak, it's the credible university, and these people really seem smart. Like that, I feel like a big misconception just in general about the Soviet Union is that the people were not too smart, but like the actual people of the Soviet Union, they were really, really smart. It was just that the government policies, in my opinion, were a little bit backwards, but the people were really, really smart. You know what I'm trying to say?
No, that's excellent phrasing. That was something I learned when I was, in high school growing up. My European history teacher mentioned that Russia was and then of course Soviet Union after that.
Right.
But let's just call it Russia for now. Given that was the core of the country, that it was an area of the world that always had a lot of potential. But it was always kind of backwards because of, like you said, politics and just the way the history had unfolded. But yeah, I mean, the technology in Russia for what it does and what it's meant for is, in many ways outstanding. It's just whether or not the average person can afford it, or how that,
like especially like their rocketry science and things like that. They're like elite even to this day. You can't really say anything about that. Another, yeah, I know you want to say something, but I really want to quickly mention another fact about the Ural State Technical University that the students were attending. So I was quickly browsing through its Wikipedia page, and I saw some notable students. So one of them is Arkady Mikhailovich, who was the mayor of Yekaterinburg. Another was Andrei Kozitsyn, who's a billionaire, and also none other than Boris Yeltsin himself, the first president of Russia.
Oh, wow.
So, these people were definitely smart. I mean, to go with like to go to the same place as a mayor, a billionaire, and the first president of Russia. They were definitely, I would say, on the higher IQ spectrum in the society.
Right. So like, it's something I was thinking about last night, when I was doing the background for this, was I was like, we mentioned this. This seems like a pretty hardcore thing to do, to go pack up all your stuff and go out and go hiking into the snow. And I think, to your point, these young folks were probably not that afraid. I mean, they respected it, but they were probably not that afraid of the environment because they were comfortable with it. So I was thinking, like, in some ways, regardless of what happened
Yeah.
to some of the other bodies, but in some ways this was almost a case where sometimes either overconfidence or lack of knowledge could get you in trouble, in an environment that normally you would be very comfortable in, and think that you understood the limitations of. So I only mention that because I'm just gonna insert another Glenn story,
Perfect.
because that's what I do. So I live here in California. I live here in Los Angeles. I've grown up in a lot of kind of high, dry heat. So I would always brag that, like, I can do 100 degrees no problem all day. I'm used to it. It used to be like what school was like before summer, and then coming out of fall, you'd be in a classroom with no air conditioning and 100 degrees.
Yeah.
And very low humidity. But this past summer, I learned to eat my words because we went to a hotter part of the country. We went to Hoover Dam, which is kind of right there in the border between Arizona and Nevada. It's near Las Vegas.
Right.
And it was at least 110 degrees. I think I in fact feel like it was hotter, or something was amplifying the heat. But I mean, we went a very small distance, and I feel like we almost died. We were there at a major tourist destination, tourists all around of us.
Yeah.
And we were trying to get back to our car in the parking lot, which was maybe 150 meters away. I mean, we were wrecked for the rest of the day after that. So I could kind of feel some empathy for these folks. Like, everything was going fine. You thought you had it under control, and then kind of lack of information. So case in point, like where they picked their camping spot, it's starting to, when we started to get into explanations, like, a lot of times people are like, well, look at this. Let's take the first explanation for what happened. That, like, there was some kind of avalanche or an avalanche sound, and they all went running out of the tent. And some of the early passages and early research was like, well, these people are experienced, and if you look at that mountain, it really isn't the right shape of a mountain and the right steepness for an avalanche to happen. And I'm like, well, but they didn't necessarily know that. I mean, they set up their campsite in the middle of a blizzard, and then they didn't exactly know where they were in the mountain, so it wasn't like they could exactly pinpoint, like, oh, well, this, we're safe here, we're not safe there. So, like, they set up this tent. And by the way, it all sounds very, very cozy and nice. Like part of me is like, as much as, like, it sucks to be out there in the cold, like a big 10-person tent, with all your friends, and you got, like, your cocoa or whatever, and you got your loaf of bread from side,
Vijay.
Yeah, you're all chomping on your Vijay bread, and you're having a good time, and you settle. You had a big long hike. You're settling down for some good rest. Tomorrow we're gonna go over the pass, and it's all gonna be downhill from there. And then here's where we get into, I guess, some of the theories. So one of the theories was that either an avalanche was happening, or they thought that an avalanche was happening, and they all, in a panic, ripped their way out.
Yep. So that's like the main, I would say, theory that was on my mind. Like, it could be definitely, at least in my eyes, it's definitely possible that maybe one of the trekkers woke up in the middle of their sleep, and they sort of heard like some sort of an avalanche, or like spotted some sort of avalanche indications, and decided to wake everyone up, and basically everyone started to panic, and they quickly decided to leave the tent undressed and so on. But then again, underdressed. But then again, why would these experienced trekkers put themselves in such a dangerous situation? It's cold, it's very cold actually. It's like what, minus 40 Celsius. I don't know what's that in Fahrenheit, but that's
Oh my
definitely,
gosh.
that's super cold, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so why would these experienced trekkers decide to rush out of their tent, not even opening the tent properly, cutting out of the tent, cutting through the tent, not dressed in in acceptable manner, given the fact that it's super cold, like even barefoot, some of the people. So to me it seems like, sure, an avalanche is a possible event, but I think I, I'm sort of leaning towards maybe it being something slightly different, maybe potentially something even more unnerving. You know what I'm saying? Like if it was a
Yeah.
standard avalanche, because like the picture that we are seeing right now, sure, like if an avalanche like this that we are seeing from the picture happens, you have no time to react. You need to get moving, right? But essentially from a picture like this where the mountain doesn't seem that steep, I feel like if an avalanche was approaching, I would at least have enough sense to at least put on some shoes. This doesn't seem like super steep, and the forest is not that far away, so the essentially the steepness of this mountain, the fact that it's not that steep, leads me to believe that maybe there was potentially something else, something more distressed. And also another thing is, like, during the initial research, I believe there were no signs of an avalanche, right? Am I not like
Yeah.
mistaken?
No, you're totally right. Yeah, they found zero evidence of an avalanche.
Yeah, so that's like interesting. So yeah, anything you want to add to the avalanche theory?
Well, yeah. So, though, let me put an asterisk. Zero evidence of an avalanche, except for the four bodies they found later that were kind of all crunched up. So, like, that was something that was really special with the four bodies they found later in the stream bed, was that the claim was the injuries, the kind of like broken ribs and like skull fractures and just deep like interior damage to the body that did not seem to be matched by any external damage, if that makes sense. So like you couldn't say, oh, his ribs are broken because somebody like hit him really hard with their fist and that's why there's bruising there, or
Yeah.
where a spear went through him or a tree went through him or something like that. It's like it seemed a little bit mysterious. But that's where I'm gonna say, well, snow is like one of those things that can be really heavy, but then it melts away again, and there's no evidence that it was there. So that's where I'm like kind of back and forth. The one thing you mentioned, like what could make them rush out of the tent. So if we're going from like more mundane explanations, and then going then towards like the more extreme possibilities. So
Yeah.
the article mentions katabatic winds. Katabatic winds being these winds that come off of mountains, and
Right.
that can have hurricane force. So once again, Glenn's story, inserting it in there. These past 2 weeks, California has been having just very high winds, especially in Los Angeles in the valley where I live, and that was part of the reason why we had all these fires. We had like no joke, like probably 10 simultaneous fires in the region, because these
Jesus Christ.
yeah, because I mean it would just be like this one, like what would
Yeah.
happen is like a fire would happen in Simi Valley, and then the wind would blow those embers further west.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then other stuff catches fire, and and then the wind is blowing so hard that I'll tell you, the same winds ripped apart one of my trees last year. So I actually had to literally clean up a probably about 1,200 pounds worth of tree
Whoa.
last year myself. And
Whoa.
that same
Whoa.
tree
That
also started.
like,
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Like the wind ripped out the tree, or
Yeah.
whoa.
It was just a leverage. It was like the tree. Full disclosure, the tree had some issues inside, but it was a big tree. It had been there for a long time, and yeah, these winds would happen right around this time of year.
Yeah.
They're called the Santa Anas. So when I was researching this, I looked it up on the Wikipedia. A katabatic wind, one of the ones they list are the Santa Anas here in Southern California. Now I'll tell you just, and then I'll end this little spiel. The wind was blowing so hard the other week here, one of those winds, that I thought that my gardener had arrived and was spraying down the front of my house with a hose. I actually went into my
Holy
backyard.
shit! Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was that loud. I thought he was either running the leaf blower, or that's how hard things were hitting the front of my house, that I thought he was spraying the front of my house. I actually went in the backyard to go let him in the side gate, and I'm like, oh, he's not here. Like, that's just this. I even have a video I'll be happy to link to or post on YouTube later of like some of those winds, but I tried to get a sample. But it's ridiculous. So this is a long-winded way of saying I could see them being in their tent, and maybe one or two of them was already paranoid about avalanches, because I've seen some pretty scary YouTubes where like a skier will get caught in an avalanche and someone has to go dig them out, and that looks like one of the worst ways I could ever think of to die, to be trapped under all that snow. So I wonder if there were some existing phobias about avalanches, and then all of a sudden this crazy wind kicks in at 50 miles an hour, and it's just, you know what I mean? It's just like the straw that broke the camel's back, and they all freak out. But yeah, I mean, it still doesn't totally understand, except for like just a blind panic, why they would like not throw their shoes on. But avalanches do move pretty fast, and maybe they just thought they didn't have.
Yeah, basically, from this like picture that we are looking at, I believe I found it on dyatlovpass.com. Yeah, it was on that. So it's a fascinating website. Everyone who is interested in this case should definitely look into it. It has so much information on the case. I think a lot more than the actual Wikipedia article does. And this picture that I found on the site, I think, perfectly illustrates what the katabatic wind theory is sort of insinuating. So, you can see that during the night, the winds started blowing really, really hard, given the fact that they were blowing, downwards from the mountain, and they had the added power of gravity, essentially sort of covering one side of the tent with snow, probably the side where the entrance was, potentially. And since the trekkers that were sleeping in the tent, they couldn't really get out through the tent entrance because it was covered in snow, as you can see here, they probably had to cut their way out from the other side and maybe rush out downwards towards the forest, towards a safer area. So maybe once the tent was starting to move a little bit, or started getting covered with snow, they sort of had some sort of a panic situation, a panic moment, and decided to just quickly evacuate the tent, hoping to return after, essentially, once the katabatic winds dumped down a little bit. So that's a theory. That's definitely a plausible theory in my eyes. Yep.
So that that handles 5 of the bodies, but then there was the part 2 of like, we found these other 4 people, and they do have injuries that looks like either an avalanche or something else, and the something else, I think, is where all these other kind of pieces of anecdotal evidence or sightings come in, like the floating spears and things like that. Before we get into that, do you have kind of a pet theory, Juras, about what happened to the other 4 people? So like the first 5 people, it seems pretty straightforward, but then what the heck happened to these other people? I mean, and why were they separate?
I mean, essentially what I'm thinking is that I cannot explain, or I do not have a concrete opinion on what was the reason that made the occupants of the tent rush out so fast out of the tent, not putting on proper clothes, knowing exactly how cold it is outside, and that they will most likely die of hypothermia. I don't know the reason why they evacuated, but I feel like the missing eye, the missing eyes, the missing tongue part of the other 3 the other three members that were found 2 months later, I would sort of I'm leaning towards that maybe some sort of animals, as you can see here, a wolverine on the visuals. Maybe some sort of animals actually came and sort of did their thing, ate some sort of body parts or something like that. So I know this is not a good explanation, but it's sort of what I'm leaning towards, because this is like the only rational explanation that I have in my mind. Anything besides this is, we are talking about some alien stuff. You know what I'm saying? Some sort of alien Soviet Union military drills, secret atomic weapons.
That's a good transition. Before we make the transition to the next point on that, I mean, I am thinking out loud. Sometimes when bodies decompose, the tongue swells up, and maybe also other tissues that push out the eyes. So yeah, to your point, it just might have been like the easy pickings.
For like some birds or something like that, right?
Yeah, some kind of scavengers. I mean, I don't know if you guys ever eat tacos in Lithuania, but one of the most delicious kinds of tacos here in the United States and of course Latin America is lengua tacos. So lengua is Spanish for tongue. Oh. Yeah, tongue tacos are great. It sounds gross, but it's awesome.
In Lithuania, people eat pig tongues.
Okay.
So nothing really surprises me. Like I personally never tried it, but it's like a thing. They take the pig tongue and they sort of peel off like the initial skin and they boil it in water. Just some Lithuanian cuisine right there.
I mean, it sounds pretty good actually. It's good in sandwiches too.
It looks, at least to me, it looks pretty bad. But yeah, go on.
Oh, and then we have a bear up there right now. So that's the other thing. We're like, well, what could either scare people out of their tent or come eat them later. So yeah, between the wolverine and then that was the other thing I was researching. I was like, gosh, as I understand it, like a brown bear, which is like the biggest or the second biggest kind of bear. As I understand it, they'd normally be hibernating during those months, but I could see a bear that maybe was near the end of its life. Often older bears are not as good at accumulating fat before hibernation. So I could see like a bear waking up early maybe and making a noise, and they're all in their tent and they're like, holy shit. They just, they don't see it. It never actually walked up to the tent maybe, but it's making a noise or something. Yeah, I don't know. Just as food for thought around that.
I mean, yeah, maybe like a bear's. It would sort of, it would sort of make sense. Maybe it's a storm. A bear also had lost its way, for say, and it started to approach the tent in the position where the tent entrance was also placed. And once the group of trackers noticed a bear, noticed it's like growling or something like that, they panicked and they cut open the tent through the other side and they rushed out. So that definitely could be a possibility, or a wolverine, because I'm not sure about bears per se in that area. Of course they probably do live around that general vicinity, but I've read that wolverines definitely live around there. So it could have been either one.
Yeah, something that made a scary noise. Oh, by the way, I did look up minus 40 Celsius in Fahrenheit. Ironically, is minus 40. Apparently, it's the one of those times where the numbers line up. Yeah, minus 40 Fahrenheit. So what do you make of? There's sort of a UFO angle. I think this is one of the reasons why maybe in the U.S. it attracts so much attention, especially in the past, let's say 10, 15 years, is that there were some anecdotal reports from other people in the area of like bright spears in the air. So things that I guess you could, at least, but just the definition of a UFO. Definition of a UFO is unidentified flying object, so they couldn't identify it. It was flying in the air, and there were these spears, and that. I mean, so I want to ask you two things: is what do you think of that in terms of like that theory and where that could lead? And then because I had some research about that, but then it's also interesting that like there's some rumor or some word that like just mentioning the spears seemed to make the investigating authorities nervous about something.
Yeah, well, I didn't really look into that much into the spheres. The only thing I know that I believe people are from like the surrounding villages around the Dyatlov Pass around that same time they did report seeing some sort of glowing spheres in the sky, right? Am I not mistaken? Yeah. So
Yeah.
so that's basically all I've read. Also, yeah, to your point, I've read somewhere as well that the authorities definitely did not want to further investigate these spheres in particular. You know, the Soviet Union authorities, they didn't really they weren't really fond of that theory.
Yeah, and that's so this episode is going to be great for keywords.
Yeah, I bet.
This is where it gets really fascinating. If you don't mind, I'm gonna spend about maybe 5 to 10 minutes on a little spiel
Of course.
about this. So, okay, so there's a couple different explanations. One of the more, I guess, prosaic explanations, or at least straightforward, about the spears is there's a theory that these were essentially what they called them landmines, but they were essentially originally supposed to be like naval, like the kind of mines that you would put in like a harbor against an enemy. That I guess all countries. So the Wikipedia article, separate from this, only really focuses on Britain and Germany during the war, but then the article here about Dylatov does mention that the Soviet Union had these, and that these things were essentially like floating bombs. So the parachute bombs that would come down, and they were set to explode above the ground, which when you explode a bomb above ground, it allows it to have kind of the full percussive effect. So it doesn't potentially throw shrapnel further than if you were to explode it in the ground, where the ground is absorbing at least half of the shrapnel and the blast. So, and they did say supposedly that these things had been tested and were being tested in the area at the time. So one explanation is that would be the reason for the injuries to at least the 4 people that seemed to have been kind of flattened by something, was that maybe one of those things went off and set everybody off into a panic, and then at some later point, alive or not, these other people were in like a blast zone. The problem I have with that explanation is they made a big point about saying there were no blast marks in the area. There was the only tree. None of the trees are flattened, because obviously something that would crunch up a person would probably knock a couple branches off a tree, right? So
of course, yeah.
Like there was only one tree that had branches knocked off, and that was the one that was by the bodies, where they thought that they climbed it to try to get oriented again. So that's okay. So that's one. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts about that?
No, not really. Like, from what I've gathered, there wasn't any signs of a blast or anything like of that sort. So, anything besides like the sightings of the peculiar spheres around that general vicinity, nothing else sort of indicates any sort of military involvement to me, unless you have some sort of other details that I'm not aware of.
I mean, my only thought was, like, I guess one of those going off could certainly look like it would be a spear in terms of like the explosive, you know what I mean? Like when you see a bomb, like a slow motion of like an explosion, it does make a spear. So like maybe villagers were seeing something like that. It might have just been one of those things that was like kind of a sideshow to what was really going on. But like maybe the authorities were like, look, that's military stuff. It's going on. We don't really talk about it. It's not really something that like we're talking about with the public, but we don't think it's relevant here. And fair enough. That could just be where they're like, look, yeah, it's just, it's like a top secret weapons test stuff, and we just don't really want to discuss it with the population of Vizhai and the rest of Russia, Soviet Union. So okay, so
Yeah.
that's one thing. Now the only other thing that I kind of seized on about this was, and this gets in down to kind of UFO conspiracy stuff, but I think that just to do justice to our audience and to the topic, it's worth covering. Um, there's something that goes on here in the United States called cattle mutilations. And it's funny because I think growing up, I always thought the cattle mutilation thing was something that they kind of definitively solved, and was kind of like the crop circle thing, where we've caught a lot of hoaxers making crop circles and things like that, and that was
Yeah.
and really kind of like the general attitude in the United States, I think, coming out of like the cat. So the cattle mutilation thing is these farmers would find some of their cattle dead, and they did not seem to be dead from something that was normal, like a predator, like a coyote or a bear or a wolf. The animals seemed to be kind of mysteriously dead, and seemed to have had parts cut out of them with a tool that was much more similar to like a scalpel in terms of the precision of the cutting, and didn't really look like an animal's
Hmm.
teeth gnawing at it. So like it's interesting. So like I said, this is one of those things where I think um, sometimes the public can erroneously think, well, this is just one of those ridiculous things that happen like one or two times. No, it actually,
Yeah.
if you actually research the topic, it's actually a really big problem, because and it's a big problem in that, not just that they don't have a solution, but that like these cattle owners really are losing like some significant amount of cattle to this issue. It's to the point where you have law enforcement in some of these states that like have opened up like really significant investigations. And I think in one case, one of the sheriffs of one of those counties actually retired and decided on his own to do a whole set of investigations on his own about this topic. Now, what the heck does this have to do with these people? Well,
Yeah,
so
like let's tie
so
this in because
where
I'm also
where am I
curious.
going?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the idea is, well, you
Yeah.
have these people whose bodies, are showing some signs of injuries. I would say specifically the eyeballs and tongue being missing would be the thing that people most often point to as sort of the unexplained part, because it's like, well, why did whatever animal eat the tongue and the eyes, but not like the cheeks, or not, you know what I mean? Not like other parts of the
Mm.
face. I mean, the nose is right there, the ears are right there. There's like other, let's call it delicious for a predator or scavenger, delicious parts of a corpse to potentially munch on. Why would it just eat the eyeball and keep going? You know what I mean? Like, wait, there's there's still a meal there. So why stop at the tongue? So I think that's where they're like, between the spears and the strange injuries and the radiation, and it's like this kind of constellation of symptoms that I think for someone that was very conspiracy minded and who was already like very much into this topic and into like cattle mutilations, and maybe was versed in like some of the strange paranormal phenomena that seems to be happening around UFOs and things. This might be
Right,
one
right,
of the
right.
first times. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard it being associated with a person here in the United States, but I think that's one of those spooky things that, like, if you let your imagination run wild, you could very easily end up in kind of like the Close Encounters of the Third Kind vein, where you're like, ooh,
Mm.
this is, UFOs doing their thing on people this time in Siberia.
I
Um,
mean, but like to be honest here, like at least to me, it's an interesting theory, but it definitely seems like like far, no, at least for me, it's like fairly far fetched, just to keep it lightly. Um, to that point, like, why would someone just you know eat the eyes and the tongue? I'm thinking like maybe like some sort of a snow hamster or something like that. Like if that makes sense,
yeah,
like a snow hamster, like one of those like I
a
don't
rat
know,
or something. Yeah, it's true, right?
snow rats, something like that, right? I mean, but it's interesting. Like, is there some sort of like official statement from like or like explanation or anything like that for why like the tongue and the eyes are missing? Because I've only read that it's that those body parts were missing, but I've not
Yeah,
really read any explanations.
and it would be good, is once again, it's like one of those things where I feel like that, they
Yeah.
didn't give us enough information, where it's like, yeah, how much of the tongue goes all the way down your throat, so it's like, how much of the tongue was missing, and like what did that sort of the part where there was still something left. I'd be, that's I'd be very curious to see like what that looked like. I'll tell you what I, as much as I like when I got into this case, and I feel like how long have you been following this case? Because I was even kind of amazed to realize that this had been a big case forever in the Soviet Union, like since it happened, kind of on and off. But I feel like in the U.S. and maybe in the West in general, we've only really been following this case for maybe 10, 20 years, just because of like lack of knowledge on our side.
I mean, I've only like been following for it like for maybe like a few years or something like that, just around the time when I started really taking interest in these, mysteries and topics of this sort. It's not like it's, widely talked about in Lithuania or anything like that. It's probably, a topic of discussion like right around this particular oblast in Russia and in Russia in general, but it's not really a mystery that it's like widely covered here in Eastern Europe,
I think there's probably a little bit of like a little bit of romance around it, in that like here in the U.S. it kind of aligns with some of the spooky, spooky pop culture stuff, and it is sort of like, oh wow, they were up in the mountains and they're camping and it's all these young people and they're, from those pictures you showed us, they're having the best time of their lives. They're in the best health of their lives, and they're about to do something, like this is their hobby, and they're about to kind of master it. And then, boom, this weird thing happens with all this other weirdness around it. I'll tell you what I think. So, just the Glenn solve for this is, I'm going to summarize it that they were in their tents. They didn't realize really where they were when they set up tent. They kind of had a rough idea, but they didn't really have a good sense for what kind of danger they were in for an avalanche. They may have been correctly assumed that there wasn't going to be an avalanche, but still had that phobia in the back of their minds. Something happens, some kind of noise, or the storm kicks in, and maybe the wind kicks into much higher gear and starts slapping snow against the tent, and like you said, it blocks the doorway, so then that kind of even amplifies their fears. So then they all panic, they run out, and then realize they made the wrong move, so they're trying to as they're freezing to death in 40 below, which I think is like cold enough to damage your lungs, as they're kind of all freezing out there, they all die. The one thing I saw about the 4 people who had the significant damage to their body was because they're not entirely sure like where they were originally before they found them, much lower or at a lower elevation in a stream bed. I think the potential was that either they fell off of some kind of ledge onto rocks, and then later, were kind of washed as snow, melting snow washes things around, washed down the stream bed, and or they could have been on what they called a snow bubble above a stream bed. So this is like kind of like maybe an area of snow that's built up over a stream, and then underneath it's kind of eroded because of the stream underneath and the warmer temperature. And then they fall through, they hit the stream, they die, they fall like, 3-4 stories, get crunched, and then die. And then later, as their bodies are kind of getting dragged down that stream, especially if your tongue and your eyeballs were protruding from you starting to, from the people starting to rot, maybe just the action of like the water and the stones and other things like that, just erode away certain features of that corpse. Yeah.
I mean, you've pretty much explained it perfectly, I believe. Another interesting thing to mention here is that during the period of 2015 up through this year 2019, experienced investigators from the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, they actually researched this case again on a request of the families, and they pretty much confirmed the avalanche with a number of important details added. So it's sort of a really similar explanation. So what the investigative committee, one of the investigators stated is that he confirmed that the weather on the night of the tragedy was very harsh, with winds speeds up to hurricane force, actually, 20 to 30 meters per second, a snowstorm and temperatures reaching minus 40 degrees, as we discussed earlier. These factors weren't considered by the 1959 investigators who arrived at the scene of the accident a week later, when weather had much improved and any remains of the snowslide settled down and had been covered with fresh snowfall. And the harsh weather at the same time played critical role in the events of the tragic night, which has been reconstructed as follows. So, they sort of reconstructed the events the investigative committee did. So on the 1st of February, the group arrived to the mountain. The group eventually traversed through the slopes, digging in the tent in the snow, which weakened the snow base. And during the night, the snow field above the tent starts to slide down slowly under the weight of the new snow, gradually pushing on the tent fabric and starting from the entrance. So the group wakes up and starts evacuating in panic, with only some able to put on warm clothes. Since the entrance was blocked, the group escapes through the hole cut in the tent fabric and descends the slope to find a place a safer place from the avalanche, only a kilometer and a half down at the forest border. And pretty much the rest of the report coincides with your theory as well, that the group of trekkers, they were badly unprepared for what came next. Hypothermia, they were lost. It was really, the snow was crazy, and they probably got really tired, and one by one they tragically passed away. So yeah, that's what I'm sort of leaning towards as well. And as for the people who had their body parts missing, the same explanation as you described. They probably fell into some sort of a ditch, and the rest is history, essentially. So I would actually definitely agree with you on this case.
Definitely. I'm really glad you picked this topic for us to cover this week, because this was something that I thought that I had read the latest and greatest on, and then it's worth, especially for our viewers or listeners, to go back into the Wikipedia, because the Wikipedia is probably 2 or 3 times longer than I remember it being last time I read it, and it had, like, case in point, this new investigation, which I had no idea was going on. It's really makes me happy that people care enough to go ahead and re-dig into it. So here's one,
especially in Russia,
Oh yeah. It's almost like a whole topic unto itself. The difference, the sort of pros and cons of what goes on there sometimes. With it's like a puzzle, an enigma, how things work there. But one thing I thought.
Go on. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Just one last thing was about the new investigation. Sure. Was they actually exhumed one of the bodies. So this has just happened this past year. The oldest of the group, I just lost my little thing, but
the 38-year-old man, right?
Yeah, Sola something.
I'm gonna I have his name right here, Semyon Alexeyevich.
Yeah, that, like, so they exhumed his body, and they're like, well, the injuries don't exactly match how it was described. I guess that
back in the 59, right?
Yeah, it looked like more like he'd been hit by a car or something. They said not exactly how, but then the weirdest part was the other DNA samples they had for the person with his name did not match the corpse. and his name was not on the list of bodies, even though they found the body, they found the right body apparently. His name was not on the list of people that was supposed to be in that cemetery. But then when they do kind of a facial reconstruction, it does seem like the face matches the photos they have of the person. So one of their theories was that, this was like the only person from the whole group who was, like older than like 4 years old during the war, let's say, or 5 years old during World War II.
Yeah.
They think that he maybe was one, like many people who sort of maybe assumed someone else's identity after the war for whatever reason. Maybe, there's in the Soviet Union, especially Stalinist Soviet Union or post-Stalinist, there could be a lot of good reasons for people to think that you're dead or that you're someone else because of just, whatever kind of punishment or, stigma.
Right.
Case in point, in the Soviet army, if you ran away during a battle to just try to save yourself, you could end up in a penal battalion and then almost certainly either die or get seriously wounded,
Right.
or lots of good reasons to like kind of hide from Stalin's goons.
Right. So we're talking about this person's Semyon right here. So, I mean, that's definitely an interesting detail that I haven't really considered. So that's very, very interesting that you mentioned that. So, I mean, essentially, I feel like we have, at least on my end, I feel like I've covered everything I wanted to cover on the Dyatlov Pass incident. Anything else you want to add before we sign out?
No, I mean, it's a very interesting case. I think it's one of those things where it's pretty awesome. I think the internet has sort of allowed something like this for like the full kind of world community to appreciate kind of mysteries like this and have a chance to solve it. I do think, given kind of our little parry around the cattle mutilation topic, that we should make that one of the future episodes, really, to put it to bed, because it's one of those weird ones where it's like, I think that'd be a good topic. But yeah, I think this is, I feel like this has been a good update to the story, because even now there's new information and new investigation, so it's very far from being a dead case, even for something that's,
of course,
so old.
Right. So, I mean, I'm guessing it's that for this week's episode. So, if you have any sort of theories, I'm talking to the listeners right now, to our wonderful viewers and listeners. If you have any sort of ideas or theories, or just tips for us on the podcast, or anything that we missed on this case in particular, definitely leave a comment down in the comment section. We greatly appreciate any sort of feedback that we get on this podcast. Also, we have been seeing, some sort of a steady stream of like new subscribers, and just in general, the podcast is sort of, little by little started to grow. So that's really, really nice. So, if you're a new listener or a new viewer, and if you enjoy the content, that, if you don't mind, we would really appreciate that you would subscribe to us and hit the notification bell so that you would be notified once our new episodes are up. So on the next week, we haven't really decided on what topic to cover. What we'll definitely be uploading next week. Not sure of the date yet, but I guess that's it. So this was the Dyatlov Pass Incident, episode number 8. Stay safe, guys, and peace out.